question. Go back and review Epicurus' letter to Herodias and to Meneses. Identify 3 ways in which the teaching of Zeno and his followers, i.e. Stoicism, differs from those of Epicurus. To which philosophical school do you feel a stronger affinity? Why? Okay, so I think that first we should define Stoicism and Epicureanism, and then talk about how they differ using examples from both of the texts. So does someone want to start with Stoicism?
Stoicism, I think, can be classified mainly by, for just some general principles. Because Seneca advocates for, like pretty much he just talks about how the body is literally only there to provide sustenance for the purpose of your journey to attain perfect reason. And so therefore, the body is irrelevant, every other matter except the purpose of the spirit and the intellect. And then he talks about how...
Okay, can I interrupt for just a bit? I think it's going to be most productive, if I may, if you take one point of Stoicism and its corresponding point in Epicureanism. Okay, just don't go through talking about, but pick out individual differences. That's really where you get a sense of how these philosophical perspectives change. So pick out one aspect of Stoicism and how it compares to Epicureanism.
Anyone have any ideas? Or I'm gonna follow.
I think the approach to death is very different between Epicurus or Epicureanism and Stoicism. Like Epicurus describes that death should neither be something to be desired nor should be something to be feared. But in letter 70, Seneca appears to be, he's describing it. I don't know, because he's not explicitly describing it as something to be desired, but he continually says that, it is wrong to live by violence and must live to die by violence in section 28. And talking about that the dirtiest of deaths is to be preferred to the cleanest form of slavery. So it almost seems like death is preferred to any suffering in life, but and to kind of take that into your own hands rather than, because basically the entirety of this book is talking about how suicide is preferable to living in any form of suffering, which I think really contrasts with Epicurus, because it seemed to me Epicurus was saying that when death comes, it comes, but you shouldn't fear it, or should you desire it, because it's just going to take its time and come when it comes. So I just thought that was really different the way he was talking about that, about taking it into your own hands.
Yeah, on page 110, to back that up, at letter number 5, a little bit above that, it says, "But as you know, life is not always worth holding on to, since it is not good to live, but to live well. So the wise man will live as long as he ought, not as long as he can." So definitely that Seneca and Stoicism, therefore, think that it's better to live well than just be living, and if you're just living, then it's better to be dead, which is definitely not what Epicurus believes.
I thought it was interesting how Seneca and Epicurus, they both present these facts that you shouldn't be afraid of death, but Epicurus was preaching that if, he's saying you should fear how you die, if you live, you want to avoid dying badly, but isn't that the same thing as fearing death? I thought that was contradictory.
Well, he says in page 114 in section 28, it is wrong to look at he says in here, he says, page 111, under 12, he says, dying well is to escape the risk of living badly. So it's not a fear of death. It's a way to use death as an escape route to avoid living. So I don't think it's living. I don't think it's a fear of death. I think if anything, it's a fear of living badly.
Right, just kind of to back that up, on letter 70, so 113 and 21, it says, the dirtiest of deaths is to be preferred to the cleanest form of slavery. So kind of what you were saying about, sorry, what you were saying about not like fearing how you were going to die. I feel like, again, I'm almost a little bit more on Will's side where it's really about the quality of life lived, and death is just kind of an out. When he says on 112, do you like your life? Then live. If you don't, then you're free to return whence you came. So death is kind of just negligible. And that agrees with, or not negligible, but not important to living your life in the moment. And I think both are really about that, about seizing the moment.
I think that's because the Epicureans, like, they think death is like your body dissolves like the particles, and so your soul doesn't exist anymore. But the Stoics kind of think that after you die, your soul continues to live. Kind of to go back to what Will said, on 111, section 8, it says, it is stupidity to die from fear of death if someone is coming to kill you away from him. So talking about like in what way you die.
Yeah, and to back that up even further, on 112, section 14, it says the eternal laws laid down by the kind of will that giving us one tree and blood and excess. So it's just kind of if you're becoming a slave, or if you're not really living the life that you should be living, then you have many excess.
I think that Seneca brought up a really interesting point on page 111, section 12, and he said, let him proceed, talking about like killing yourself, he said, let him proceed and break the chains of slavery. A man should win others' approval for his life and his own approval for death. And I thought it was really interesting that he basically said that the only time that you can do something without fear of judgment or retribution or anything like that is if and when you choose to kill yourself. Like that's the only action you can ever take in your life that no one can judge you of, and like someone else's approval of it doesn't matter because dead. And I thought it was really interesting that he chose to examine that part of it.
Yeah, I mean, he kind of leaves it up to interpretation almost. Like, he's not necessarily a cynic saying that, okay, you can do this, but you can't do this. Like he says on letter 70, section 11, he says there are many arguments that can pull in either direction. So he's not necessarily instructing someone by some, like, concrete instructions on what to do. It's kind of just based on what's in your situation at the time, and he gives us a lot of examples, lots of different people. So.
Yeah, I feel like the real difference, like the reason the Epicureans and Stoics differ so much on this, although I guess there are some similarities, is because the Epicureans don't believe in like trying to fight fortune, and like basically the entire basis for this suicide argument is like on well, I have different page numbers, but in letter 70, like on like the second page, he says, should my motto be fortune is all powerful over the living when it can be fortune is powerless over one who knows how to die? Like the whole idea of Stoicism is that like you're supposed to like steel yourself against fortune and like be prepared for anything, while like the Epicureans would just be like, whatever, come what may.
And I also thought it was like, I felt like a lot of our reading, this past reading, was about like rational decisions and like the steps you have to take, like gaining knowledge leads to wisdom, leads to virtue. But on page but letter 70, line 12, he says, let a man take his leave as his impulse seizes him. And it just seems so such an irrational type decision, and there's no like basis behind it. It's just like if fortune doesn't give you a good hand, then it's okay to opt out, like if your life is going backward. And I just thought that was pretty questionable.
Yeah, for sure. Because I mean, I went back and looked at, I think his letter to Menicius, and he talks about how Epicurus talks about at least how death is nothing to us, and then it's on like page 29 in that letter, and then he says the wise man neither rejects life nor fears death. So that's what I think is also the crucial difference. Is like, from what I can gather from Epicurus on that part, he's not for suicide in general. I mean, I'm sure there are probably circumstances that might be appropriate for him, but going back what he said in that letter, or that letter to Nicias.
And I think it's important to note that the Stoics have a certain type of suicide that they think is okay. Like, do you remember it's letter 70 around 26? This is the or around here is where they're talking about the kind of the fussy suicides where that guy like stuffed that sponge down his throat. They said that's not how you commit suicide. You commit suicide like bravely, as opposed to like a coward.
Yeah, 114:28, he says that it's wrong to live by violence, but must be to die by violence.
Yeah, that's yeah.
I mean, can you classify any suicide as being very brave though?
Depends on who you are. I think they do.
I think it's hard to classify most suicides as brave.
Why?
Well, I'm saying,
Is that
From
your
what if-
society speaking or you?
well, no, I'm just saying that in general, most people would say, well, I guess I'm making a sweeping generalization again, but
Excellent.
I'm just saying that if you're taking one's life, it's a lot of times I feel like maybe it's because you're not brave enough to maybe see the Epicurus side that maybe something else will come around. You're saying my life is not what I want it to be at this point, so I'm gonna take it.
Yeah, I don't think Seneca is saying that it's like if things don't go your way, then here's an escape route. I think he's saying more along the lines of like if you're succumbing to I don't know exactly how he says it, but if you're like succumbing to any form of like slavery, if you see the life that you're living is not a good life, and like he even talks about like further on, like he talks about like what is good like virtue. You can see we have all the aspects of time which are like past, present, and future. So like if you can see that your future, if you're still not going to live well, then I mean, to me, it's like it's not just like if things aren't going your way, kill yourself. It's like if you have a very good idea that things are not going your way, then you have a way out. I don't think he's advocating just like kill yourself when things aren't going well. I think he's saying that like if you don't see your life going the way that it needs to go, then it's very possible.
Well, I feel like Epicurus would argue like the opposite and say that your life could change any moment. And
Well,
you
he
don't
would-
necessarily ever really know how it's going to go.
Oh, he would argue different because he also Epicurus also says that death is sense experience. He says that right. He says death is nothing because it is not a sensual experience. At 124, and obviously that's very very different from Seneca. As Seneca, doesn't regard our sensual experiences as really like objective. So yeah, they're definitely very very different thinkers. Right.
And Epicurus says the wise man neither fears death nor rejects life. So he obviously wouldn't agree with Seneca that you should just kill yourself if like your life isn't good. But that's the difference. That's like what we're looking at.
Yeah, and to go back to our last point with the guy with the sponge killing himself, I noticed in these letters it seems like he has some, like he addresses, from those that we read this one, a kind of argument that may be posed to him, especially in like letters 92 and 90, I think. And in this one, he also throws in like some sarcastic comments, like where he said the die fussily thing, because then he follows it with like, what a brave man way to be given a choice of his death. He said, deprived in all respects, he found out how to create both death and a weapon for himself to show you that nothing else but willpower delays are dying. But each man judges the deed of a fierce fighter as he chooses, so long as this is agreed that the dirtiest of deaths is to be preferred to the cleanest form of slavery. So, I mean, I think he's pretty much all about any form of suicide, if no matter if it's creative or not.
Okay, does anyone have any more on this, or do you want to move on to another?
Yeah. Sorry. On page 114, letter 70, it's 26. It's in the second installment of the sea battle of the barbarians, buried the spear he had been given against the enemies deep down his throat. Why, he asked, did I escape all this torture and humiliation long ago? Why did I wait for death when I had a weapon? So I guess I'm kind of confused if he's like, well, like if he's saying that he should have died because of this torture and humiliation, but if he was like like a good person, like living like a wise life, wouldn't he not, like, wouldn't that like not affect him, like the torture, like if you guys know what I'm saying? I'm sorry, I have trouble with
I think he says like if a wise man knows that his death is coming and he's going to suffer more in like what's left, it's kind of like
like basically his whole point was if you're like a wise man, then you can tolerate any pain, so you wouldn't really have any pain or suffering or torture in your life.
Where is
did he say that?
no, where did he
Well,
say that?
Yeah, he
no
says that
pain,
in
like, you can
letter
endure
92.
pain. Oh,
Or is it one letter? Yeah, it's letter 92 about happiness. It talks about sorry, I'm just trying to find it. He talks about how like a wise man's happiness cannot be destroyed by bodily affliction, and that is. I really write down any pages. But he talks about it a lot because he gives examples, and there's the main kind of argument that he's facing, he thinks, is that he goes through different forms of suffering. And like, well, what about these guys who are crippled, and how do they still attain happiness? And like, and that's just basically being reliant on reason and perfect reason and self-sufficiency. And that also goes to the point where it talks about how it says like if you're truly happy, you can die at any moment, really. And that is, I can't find it, but
Just for what you said, there's no like line numbers on this, but on the PDF for 92, it says on the first page, it says the happy life depends upon this and this alone, our attainment of perfect reason, for it is not but this that keeps the soul from being bowed down and stands its ground against fortune. Whatever the condition of their affairs may be, it keeps men in trouble. So like it seems like if you have perfect reason, you shouldn't be affected by any like bouts of misfortune that you go through. So this letter just really confused me. I feel like it's really confusing.
I think the difference is between whether the pain is forever or if it's a bout of misfortune that you must endure. So being a slave, that's something where it's almost like an inescapable kind of misery. And like it's like a point in your life where you're not living because you're owned by someone else, and it's like it's not someone who's going through a rough patch in life. I think that's the difference. Yeah.
Oh, I was saying like in this being a slave isn't just like being owned by someone else, like you can be a slave too.
It's like finding like at which point you become that slave to something.
I think it's like, I don't know, to me it seems like his main point is on letter 70, page 112, like section 16, where he says human affairs are well placed because nobody is wretched except for them through his own fault. And I think that was the key thing, is he was saying like, it's almost like you can't really complain because if you want to fix it, you can. Like if you want to escape any suffering that you have, like if you are, like regardless of whether you should be able to handle this suffering, if you physically cannot, emotionally cannot, for whatever reason, then you have no right to be miserable or no right to be wretched and suffer because you have every opportunity given to you to escape this. And so I think that's like what he was trying to say, like regardless of, you know, like he was saying like you should be able to handle it, but I mean, not everyone can, and I'm sure he was aware of that. So I think that, I mean, he was just basically saying if you can't handle it, then you shouldn't complain. You have every power to fix it.
Yeah, it says life was known against the will. Exactly.
Isabel, can may I just, as your coach, suggest you move on to
Yeah, I
another
was just
aspect
about
of
to,
Stoicism and Epicureanism? I think you've established that the Epicureans do not believe in an immortal soul, right? Death is the end of life, right? The Stoics believe that the soul continues on, right? And that introduces a whole set of different aspects about how we look at death. Okay? The the Stoics seeing death as a release of the soul from the imperfections of life. The Epicureans, a cessation of life.
Okay, I would like to move on to self-sufficiency, because it's important in both Stoicism and Epicureanism. Epicureanism says that self-sufficiency is a great good, and that you don't always have to make do with few things, but that if you have to, that you can. And then Stoicism kind of echoes that point in letter 9, page 16, paragraph 5. It says, the wise man is contented, not so that he wants to go without a friend, but so that he is able to go without. The word able means that accepting the loss of a friend calmly. So I thought that was very similar in that principle of self-sufficiency, that you don't have to go without, but that you can if that situation arises. Does anyone else have anything to say about self-sufficiency?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think he's not really stressing the fact that having a bunch of things is bad. What's really matters is the tolerance for the loss of them. So, I mean, if you can be the wealthiest man in the world, that's really matter too much. But what matters truly is that if you take away all those things and destroy all those things, it's just you alone, like walking through the city without your family, whatever. As because that analogy or reference, that's like the most important thing. I mean, that you can tolerate being self-sufficient of your own self, like your spirit provides all that you need.
And do you think that Seneca's beliefs on that are influenced at all by his wealth?
Yeah, I've been like, thinking about this whole time, because especially in which letter was it? 90, Philosophy and Progress. He like has all of these sentences that really denounce like consumerism and like wealth that he sees. Like trying to find him like with like the gilded roofs and all this stuff that he thinks is unnecessary. Yet he is wealthy and like ends up living in like, you know, nice whatever, what was it called? When he retires to his lands.
To his villa?
Yes, the villa. Which was undoubtedly, you know, made by architects and these people that he believes are unnecessary and useless.
Yeah, but at the same time, in letter 18, he says that no one is worthy of the God unless he is by his possessions. I'm not forbidding you to win them, but I want to assure that you win them without fear, and you will only achieve this in one way. Persuade yourself that you will live happily without them. If you always look on them as if they were going to disappear. So, I mean, like, he may be rich, but I mean, like, I'm going to assume that Seneca, you know, practices what he preaches, and so in which case, I don't think it's really relevant how much he has because he knows how to possess them.
I think if this is like, if he's so wealthy, then like he's around, like the people that he surrounds himself with on a daily basis are also extremely wealthy. And like going off what you said in letter 90, page 179 and 180, he's talking about how like they went from like living in like caves and stuff like that to being able to build houses. And he's talking about the first folks with the little wood with wedges, and he's saying that they were not preparing buildings for banquet called in. Nor was pine or fir conveyed in the long train of vehicles that shook the streets, just as suspend coffered ceilings made from it and heavy with gold. And then he's talking about like just living in huts, and he says men live without anxiety under these shelters, the thatch covered freemen, whereas slavery lives under marble and gold. And so I think that's really interesting. And maybe it's not a comment on his own wealth because, I mean, we can assume that he practiced what he preached, but as far as like everyone around him, maybe he saw the suffering or the, I guess, enslavement to their wealth.
Do you want to move on to another comparison? Anyone have any things that they saw?
When we were talking about Epicureanism, we talked about ataraxia, which you called like insulation and the word disturbance, which was the highest good the Epicureans, they said, pleasure is lack of pain in the body, disturbance in soul, and pleasure was the main goal. And then Stoicism has
Apatheia.
apatheia, and he explains it in letter 9. This is page 16, kind of near the top. But we have to fall into ambiguity if we want to express apatheia, briefly in one word and call it unfeelingness, since this can be taken as the opposite of what we mean. We mean the man who spurns every feeling of distress, but it will be understood as the man who cannot endure any distress. So consider whether or not it's better to speak of an invulnerable spirit or a spirit set beyond all suffering. This is the difference between us Stoics and Epicureans. Our wise man overcomes every discomfort but feels it, and theirs does not even feel it. So that just goes back to Epicureanism and just the idea of ataraxia being insulation, and Stoicism, they feel deeply their discomforts, which kind of goes back to what we're talking about with suicide, and just their relation to the soul is very different than Epicurus, where everything is really based on sense perception and feeling, which again it's kind of complicated to look at that. I mean, he says theirs does not even feel it, but Epicureanism says that it's all about sense perception and feelings, right? So how can we reconcile the two is kind of my question. That confused me a little bit. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's a great quote, because that's one of the few times that he actually sits and says, this is the difference between the two of us. But we also have to remember that it's from his point of view, so that doesn't necessarily mean that it's exactly what the Epicureans would think, which is, I think, where that, the consequence from. Anyone have any thoughts? Anyone?
You good?
No.
I didn't. Yeah.
You know,
Oh,
I'm just gonna call it.
In letter 92, I would say the page and stuff, but it's online. But he talks about how the greatness of soul is having complete truth and the importance of having that, and achieving perfect reason and on those lines. And he says the wise man's soul equals what would be proper for God. And he kind of he brings in Epicurus and says why feel free from disturbance when you feel free to contemplate the universe and nature. And so he does a direct comparison of exactly what you said, anorexia, of how their whole thing is just about being free from disturbance, when Stoics are completely okay with it as long as they're able to contemplate the universe and the truth and divine nature and on those lines.
Right, reason and pleasure being the different highest goods.
Yeah.
For
Because prudence was Epicurus' biggest thing.
Mhm.
And
And they're moments of prudence and wisdom, but I mean they're both philosophers, so they have I think they have the same basis of understanding the world is just on these few things like reason and pleasure. That's where it gets a little bit very different.
Okay, what about God? What are the two different things about God?
The Epicureans seem to call religion kind of irrational, and the Stoics seem to think that the world is kind of all part of God.
What do you mean by irrational?
That religion is created to express human fears.
But Epicureans say that you should believe that God is indestructible and blessed.
Yeah.
It says that gods exist, but not like many people believe they are. Maybe that's what you mean by religion. Religion, a lot of people believe different things and that they're incorrect, but not necessarily just God. God is there, he's indestructible, he's blessed. How does that relate to Seneca, what he says about gods?
Seneca, at the beginning of letter 90 on page 178, he basically credits the gods for philosophy. He says, who can doubt that we live by the gifts of the gods, but live well by the gifts of philosophy? if it were not the gods who were doing such philosophy upon us, they gave absolute knowledge to no man and the ability to practice philosophy to us all. So like that's a big shout out, I guess. You know, so I think it's really interesting that they're basically crediting their own philosophy to the ability that the gods have given them, you know, and I don't think that Epicureans ever do have quite a large gesture in that way.
I also think it's important of how we define what they're understanding as God and divinity, because a lot of times I think they associate it with nature, or at least Stoics do in a sense, especially with Seneca's analogy of saying how like the God is in the universe as our mind is in our body, and so they're intertwined in that sort of level. And Epicurus also talks about how gods welcome men like themselves. Their virtues dictate interactions with others. Some of that was said in the letter to Minucius. So I definitely think, exactly what Natalie said. Like the Stoics are, I think, a lot more focused on associating gods with nature and attributing a lot more things of human qualities to them, except for vices. And Epicureans more see it as just kind of like the function of the universe, maybe. Probably maybe wrong. Any thoughts?
Does anyone have other comparisons between the two?
Just to continue it since that's everything. And Epicurus on section like 124, but maybe it's page 1, just kind of page 124, it says that God's welcome them like themselves, also known as those who are congenial to their own virtues. So I feel like that's pretty consistent to what Seneca tries to make.
I just looked it up about Epicureanism. So it emphasizes the neutrality of the gods and that they don't interfere with human lives, and that they have souls the same way that humans have souls, except the souls in humans are capable of escaping the bodies, and the souls of the gods cannot. Just background.
Wait, about the souls, Epicurean, and this concept of the soul?
It states that gods, matter, and souls are all made up of atoms, and that gods possess souls, but their souls adhere to their bodies without escaping. Humans have the same kind of souls, but the forces binding human atoms together do not hold the soul forever.
Right.
Speaking of the whole soul thing and the particles, what about natures, like the natures of humans? Epicurus talks a lot about like the specific makeup of everything, and Stoicism doesn't really talk much about that, but it talks a lot about nature. So, anyone have any thoughts on comparisons between the two? Well, what does Stoicism say about nature? Is it important or no? Yeah. How so?
Well, he talks about there are four natures, which I know it's not exactly meant, but on letter 124, 273, there are these four natures: a tree, an animal, a man, and a god. Kind of how it's ascending reason and like ascending goodness. And like the page 4, he says, "Why is there no good in a tree or an animal? Because they have no reason." So he's drawing a very clear line, which was drawing a very clear line between that kind of like baser, and even infants too, kind of like baser, unreasoning, irrational, which we read in letter 90, and then a man and a god, how we're connected to God or gods. I don't know if that's what she meant by nature, but that's what I got out of it, is that nature is not something that we like look to for inspiration, it's something we like grow out of.
Yeah, and how does reason relate to that?
he said good is not present in anything unless it has reason, and especially when he's talking about infants. Well, obviously a tree can't think, so there's no reasoning there. A child can, think and react to its environment, but there's no higher. It doesn't change behavior. It doesn't change reaction, and there's no contemplation or reflection. So I think that's really important.
We also need to, when we're discussing nature, look at letter 90, page 181, around 17, 18, 19 area. It's talking about how we have, what we've done with nature, we've kind of crafted nature to suit our needs better. It says that nature is enough for erring man, this luxury that has rebelled from nature, daily it eggs itself on, has been growing for so many ages and fosters its own developed by its talent. So when we're talking about nature, I think it's important to note that Seneca believes that nature has provided us with everything that we could possibly need, but the things that we do with nature are usually just kind of, I don't want to say lustful, but they're for our own personal
luxury.
Yeah, luxury.
Yeah, so it talks about how we abuse it in section 19, that in fact our demand for everything was limited to our actual need. We made those things possible marvelously, made them things to be acquired by complex and multiple grasp. Nature is an effort of its own demands. It is luxury that has rebelled from nature. And so I think that's really interesting. He said that basically nature has provided, and this is a common theme I think throughout all of Stoicism, that everything that you actually need is provided for you. It's the excess that you need to slave for or suffer to obtain. And I think that's another thing he's pointing out with nature, that once again nature has provided everything that we need for it, and we're the ones who have since we use so much and we demand so much, that's what has made it costly, and that's what the complex things that we demand nature to give us is what has made it difficult for us to obtain.
And that's very interesting because in Epicureanism, it says natural things are easy to obtain and groundless things aren't. So that very much agrees. In the last few minutes of class, there's a second part to the question: to which philosophical school do you feel a stronger affinity? Does anyone feel a stronger affinity to either of the two, or think one is more interesting than the other?
I think it's. Oh, sorry. You read something.
Well, personally, I like the element of Stoicism. It's steeling yourself against fortune, and still feeling everything and caring for everything. So even if things happen that are bad, you can learn from them, and that's worth the pain, I guess.
I was just gonna say, personally, we've read a ton of Stoicism and not so much as Epicureanism. Even though there's what we are in Epicureanism that may actually be sufficient enough to compare this. But I feel as though I would rather like to read a little more about Epicureanism just to see exactly and know more of his background as well.
So you feel like you know more about Stoicism, so you can therefore.
Yeah, at least so I can compare the two if I'm making a decision between the two. But
I felt a pretty strong affinity to Stoicism when they were talking about the liberal studies, especially being here at Rhodes. I think that what he said about liberal studies brings us nothing for virtue, but rather prepares you to accept virtue in your life. I think that's totally accurate, and I think that's kind of what we saw that at the very beginning of the semester, that speaker Birmingham. Yeah, I think that's kind of what he was saying.
I think that's funny because he wrote this so long ago, but it's still so applicable to us.
I think it's really interesting that I don't know. I find Stoicism more interesting because I feel like Stoicism is born of a place of a fear of pain, but I think Epicureanism is born of a place of lack of pain, and so I think it's really interesting how you can see those two themes throughout, even though they have a lot of similarities. I think those are where the differences arise. That Stoicism is all about, it comes from a place of fear, of suffering, and all about how to escape that or insulate yourself from that. But I think Epicureanism is describing a life that should be with a lack of feeling.
Anyone else have a stronger affinity for one or the other? Or have any specific aspects about either that they like?
I definitely enjoyed the Stoic point of view pertaining to senses, sense experiences,
Sorry.
They don't view it as something that is necessarily like guides us and should guide us. They view science as something that can actually mislead us. And I just enjoyed reading a lot about that.
Isabel, can I just have
Yeah.
one minute to go or two? Thank you, great discussion. I want to just introduce a Greek term here that I think is going to be really important going forward. Zach points out, we don't have a lot of Epicurean writings compared to the Stoics. That's because the Stoics, one of the tenets of Stoicism is that one accepts one's lot in life. Okay, the Stoics use this metaphor of the stage of theater, right? You're cast in a role, and that's your role. Deal with it. Okay? That's the disadvantage of those who are cast in very unfortunate situations. For the Stoics, it says, so what? So what if you're a slave? Doesn't matter. That's your role in life. Deal with it. Okay? Well, that is, I think that all of us would accept that that's kind of, I don't know, problematic. Okay? That also means that if you happen to be the wealthiest person on the planet,
Exactly.
great, deal with it. Okay? That's your lot in life. Make the most of it. So Stoics participated. I mean, it was a Stoic notion that one is to take one's role and do as much as possible with it. Therefore, why do we have more writings from Stoics? Because Stoics were more visible in society. It was a philosophical perspective that allowed them to be senators and emperors and everything. That's their life. That's their lot in life. Epicureans, however, were all about separating themselves from the annoyances of life. Okay, so in letter number 92, where he talks about, he uses a Greek term. The Greek term he uses is aoklesia. Aoklesia, which literally means to be without disturbances. But in this, the root of this word is oklos. Which means crowd. In other words, and this was from the Stoics' point of view, the main criticism of Epicureanism is that if you're really going to be an Epicurean, one has to separate oneself from society to a certain extent to avoid the crowd, to insulate oneself from the disturbances out there, and also to learn as much about nature in order to control, or in other words, the Stoics accept your fate and fortune. The Epicureans find out what it is, study it, figure it out, learn how to insulate oneself from it, avoid the crowd. So actually, there is a lot of Epicureanism in the writings of Seneca. He's referring to Epicurus all the time. So more on this later, because these two philosophical schools are going to animate the other things that we're going to be reading. So now we're going to shift gears, and we're going to read Acts, I think is our next one. Great, have a great weekend.